Well, welcome to the program, everyone. On the day, Britain revealed to the world how it sees its own role in the invasion of Iraq, the toppling of Sadam Hussein, and the conflict that followed. The Chilcot report was delivered today in almost uber-human dimensions, 2.6 million words, 5 times longer than War and Peace. And the findings accuse lawmakers, a government, diplomats, a military, and a prime minister attempting to execute uber-human feats, to bend and to form the truth to fit their narrative of a war Chilcot concludes was wrong and a failure.
We have concluded that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. Military action at that time was not a last resort. We have also concluded that the judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified. Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Sadam Hussein were wholly inadequate. The government failed to achieve its stated objectives.
Well, at the center of the Chilcot report and its most damning conclusions is the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Upon release of the Chilcot report today, Blair spoke at length, offering his apology for the war and taking full responsibility for the decisions surrounding it. Blair appeared visibly shaken by the report's findings, but again, as he has in the past, said the decision made at the time following 9/11, that decision was made in good faith. And those decisions, he said, were the right decisions at the time.
The intelligence assessments made at the time of going to war turned out to be wrong. The aftermath turned out to be more hostile, protracted and bloody than ever we imagined. The coalition planned for one set of ground facts and encountered another. And a nation whose people we wanted to set free and secure from the evil of Saddam became instead victim to sectarian terrorism. For all of this, I express more sorrow, regret, and apology than you may ever know or can believe.
All right, that was Tony Blair there offering his apology earlier today. We want to expand this story beyond London. We're going to start, though, in London, and I'm happy to welcome on the day Sadam Hussein with the Wall Street Journal in London. So, Rob, it's good to see you. And here at the big table with me is Daniel Gerlach. He is our Middle East Affairs analyst and editor-in-chief of Zenith magazine. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Let me start with you, Daniel, and I'll ask both of you this. What, if anything, changed today because of this report?
Well, I don't think this report will have any judicial consequences, and I think it's been stated very clearly. But I think it will probably change something about the legacy of Tony Blair and about the legacy of this whole operation in Iraq. I think this whole Iraq war and the mismanaged administration of Iraq have so much contributed to an atmosphere of conspiracy theories in the Middle East about Western interest and Western self-interest and selfishness in its Middle East policies, and that damage hasn't been healed so far. And I think this report could probably contribute, at least show that Britain is trying to deal with its own past and not waiting for the historians to go to the archives in 30 or 40 years and trying to investigate about the past. There's still going to be plenty of work for the historians to do, but this is a source that they can now work on.
So, Rob, what would you say? I mean, it sounds like Daniel is almost describing this age of illiberalism that, that you've been writing about.
Well, I think as far as the direct consequence of the report, one will be a great deal of self-congratulation and self-flagellation and moral self-satisfaction in London among the anti-war quarters or among some of the people who supported the war and then turned against it. As far as judicial consequences, I'm glad that nothing of that sort was recommended, because it would be absurd to prosecute democratically elected leaders for making decisions based on faulty intelligence. The real concern on my part is the fear that this will reinforce all the wrong lessons about the West's role in securing the Middle East, in the Middle Eastern order that the West, and especially the US, has underwritten and created for the past 6-7 decades, and reinforce the isolationist tendencies, to be frank about it, that are prevalent both in the US and on the other side of the Atlantic in Europe.
Well, you're picking up on what Tony Blair was saying today. He was alluding to the situation in Syria being an example of what happens when you do have a world that is retreating from that position.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as you pointed out, one of the big elements of the Chilcot report is the alleged failure of the coalition of the US and UK primarily to do enough in the UN Security Council or through diplomatic means to disarm Sadam Hussein. What this forgets, first of all, is the nature of the Hussein regime, which we had known for 25 years as truly, Saddam was a one-man weapon of mass destruction unto himself, waging war in Iran, waging war in Kuwait, attempting genocide against the Kurds, so on and so forth. And the experiences that we've had subsequent to that in Syria, where the U.S. initially hesitated to act, that the U.S. premised action on UN Security Council approval, and now you see the disaster that's flowed from that. It's still not clear whether Assad has given up his chemical weapons. 500,000 people dead, millions of refugees coming. Yeah,
let me pull in Daniel here. I just want to ask, there are a lot of people today saying that Syria is an example of what happens when you don't act the way the coalition acted in 2003 with Saddam Hussein. Do you buy that?
No, I don't buy that, though I think it's just totally legitimate to speculate on what would have happened if Saddam Hussein had stayed. I think people give credit to the United States and to Great Britain for the rise of jihadism and the rise of the so-called Islamic State in the region. There is some truth in it, yeah. But the argument, I don't buy the argument entirely, because Saddam Hussein's rule gave rise to jihadism too. It's not very well documented, and there's not a lot of research being done on this. But during the 1990s, Saddam was encouraging tribal Islamist militias because he didn't trust his own state institutions anymore. So the rise of radical Sunnism in his country was also, in a way, a consequence of Saddam's policies. And we should not forget that there's an antecedent to the Iraq War, which was the years of sanction, in which Iraq was suffocated. And, it's not only this single operation that destroyed the state. Yeah. Of course, there have been a lot of mistakes made in the aftermath, but I think there is partly truth in it, but to blame it all on this one isolated event, I think, is wrong.
Let me just pull a bite from Mr. Chilcot that was said earlier today, accusing the UK basically of undermining the stability of the global order with what it did in 2003. We've got that soundbite. Let's take a listen.
Without evidence of major new Iraqi violations or reports from the inspectors that Iraq was failing to cooperate and they could not carry out their task, most members of the Security Council could not be convinced that peaceful options to disarm Iraq had been exhausted and that military action was, therefore, justified. Mr. Blair and Mr. Straw blamed France for the impasse in the UN and claimed that the UK government was acting on behalf of the international community to uphold the authority of the Security Council. In the absence of a majority in support of military action, we consider that the UK was, in fact, undermining the Security Council's authority.
That is quite an indictment right there, to say that.
Yeah, it's not very subtle.
No.
Indeed.
What about Sohrab? Sohrab, do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think that the UN Security Council is not a body on which the US or the West should ultimately rest or condition the decisions that we make about our own security, because it's a body in which sit Russia and China, which are, in Russia's case, a serious adversary and a state that threatens right now the territorial integrity of Europe and is trying to redraw the map of Europe. And China is a serious rival to U.S. power. I would never, as an American, want the U.S. when it comes to the most kind of moments-like decisions like that to give sovereign decisions about U.S. security over to a body like the UN Security Council. And I think that's still an opinion that's popular and it's certainly yeah.
So I'm going to have to let me just take you to task there for just a moment. I mean, what about the theater, the drama that we saw there? You remember Colin Powell showing the Security Council the evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And we now know, of course, that people were, they were looking at a mirage. But the fact that the U.S. was going to the UN to prove its case proves that it was trying to use established order and roles and conduits of order to still go to war. You can't, what you have in this report is that the decision to go to war was basically an attempt to erode that.
No, I disagree. I think that obviously, as a first matter, it's always good to go to the United Nations and try to make your case to the Security Council. But again,
with the truth,
if I were in president, at the time, what they believed to be the truth at the time, including what Gerhard Schröder's government believed. I mean, the German intelligence agencies were louder than any about their belief that the Saddam was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. So it wasn't just the Americans or the Brits. So they went before and made their case. But when it comes to making a decision, if I were in the president's shoes, at the end of the day, knowing what we knew about Saddam and the intelligence reports, again, proved to be faulty later, but what they knew at the time, I wouldn't give up U.S. security to what the Chinese or the Russians think, or the French.
All right. We're going to take a short break there. Sohrab Ahmari with the Wall Street Journal in London. Sohrab, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us on the day. We appreciate it. We want to talk a little bit more now about Chilcot, that key report on Britain's involvement in the Iraq War. The publication has been highly anticipated both by the families of the British soldiers killed in the conflict and people across the country. Here's a background for you.
It was one of modern Britain's longest and costliest military actions. For 7 years, British troops fought and died in Iraq as part of a US-backed coalition. But as the years and casualties mounted, so too did British opposition to the war.
Tony Blair! To the Hague! Tony Blair! To the Hague!
Today, the Iraq Inquiry.
The Iraq Inquiry, led by Sir John Chilcot, began its work in late 2009. It has spent years analysing why the British government took part in the 2003 invasion. The inquiry looked closely at the decisions taken by former Prime Minister Tony Blair and his cabinet. One of the central questions, was the Blair government truthful about why it went to war? Claims that Sadam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction were never substantiated. But Blair continued to maintain that the Iraqi leader posed a risk to his neighbours.
It isn't about a lie or a conspiracy or a deceit or a deception, it's a decision. I had to take the decision. And I believed, and in the end so did the Cabinet, so did Parliament incidentally, that we were right not to run that risk.
The Blair government also faced accusations that it didn't do enough to prepare British troops. 179 British service personnel were killed in Iraq. Some of their families say Blair and his ministers were criminally negligent in relation to their deaths. a sentiment echoed by many anti-war campaigners.
Donald Rumsfeld. He has been, certainly on the moral side, been sentenced many times over, as George Bush has. So it's a question of fine-tuning this and leading this, if we want to give any meaning to international law, to which Britain is party, then it is very clear that the straight line should lead to a court case.
The inquiry has taken more than 7 years, longer than the actual Iraq War and the subsequent occupation. For some of the relatives of UK troops killed in the war, the report's findings have boosted their desire to see Tony Blair prosecuted.
Yeah, and that's where we are right now. And we're back at the big table here. We want to pull in our U.S. correspondent, Richard Walker. He joins the conversation from Washington. Good evening to you, Richard. Let me throw this to you. Has there been anything even close to the Chilcot report in the U.S. regarding the U.S.'s role in the Iraq War?
Well, there hasn't been anything quite as sprawling or as long-lasting as this report. But what you have had is a series of slightly more focused reports from a number of different organs of the U.S. political establishment, going way back to the early days after the invasion itself. So as early as early 2004, the Bush administration initiated its own inquiry into the intelligence issues surrounding the start of the war. Also, the Senate Intelligence Committee up in Congress produced a number of volumes of a report looking into intelligence issues, not just in the lead up to the war, but also with relation to the aftermath of the invasion. And also you've had a number of reports looking at specific things, for instance, the report into torture by the CIA during the War on Terror. That was released a year and a half ago, a scathing report by the Senate Intelligence Committee there. So what you have had is a large number of bodies looking at this over a very long period of time, going over a lot of the same ground.
And, you know, Blair said today that Iraq post-Sadam Hussein was automatically a playground for extremists and radicalized elements who would work to basically get rid of stability. Let's just take a listen to what he had to say.
The danger of revolution or regime change in any country where Islamism is likely to be a major factor is that once the dictatorship is removed, no matter how abhorrent, elements of extremism will move into the vacuum to cause chaos and instability. So unlike Kosovo, or indeed even Germany after World War II, the challenge becomes not one of reconstruction but of security. Therefore, if possible, evolution or an agreed process of change is better than the overthrow of the existing order without agreement.
So it's not about, planting democracy. It's about ensuring stability. Doesn't that fly in the face of what we heard, though, right after the invasion, particularly what the neoconservatives were touting, that it would be part of the mission accomplished, to plant democracy in Iraq?
You know, I remember this because in 2003 I was just about to accomplish my degree in Middle Eastern Studies, and I followed the debate inside the Middle East community, Middle East experts community. And you had an almost absurd situation where those that were traditionally very critical, sometimes even hostile to the Arab world, would all of a sudden say, don't these people deserve democracy? Wouldn't they be capable to embrace democracy if we bring it to them? And on the other hand, you had the old Orientalists or the Middle Eastern studies people who were traditionally amenable and also very liberal in dealing with the Middle East, who all of a sudden said, no, you will see tribal friction, you will see sectarian strife returning, and you cannot just apply the Western model of democracy on the Middle East. And this was a very interesting situation where it was very difficult to see clear, and even in the Middle East expert community, people were like, probably it's going to work.
Yeah.
But I think the analysis of the Saddam regime was poor. And as I mentioned earlier, also understanding what destruction of the state already had happened previous to the Iraq War, due to the sanctions, due to Saddam's regime, and due to Saddam's instrumentalization of Islamism, making himself the champion of Sunni Islam, this couldn't have passed unnoticed.
We've got one more soundbite from Blair, and then I'm going to throw it to you, Richard. And this is basically Blair's world view, basically that Syria today is exactly what one should expect if you do not take steps as we saw in Iraq. Let's take a listen to that.
And to those who think removing Saddam is the cause of the turmoil in the Middle East, and that there is some unbroken line between the removal of Saddam in 2003 and what is happening in Iraq today, I say the following. After the surge in 2007, Al-Qaeda was defeated and marginalized. In 2010, Iraq was relatively stable. It was in Syria. After the Arab Spring, when AQ became ISIS, headquartered in Raqqa, Syria, where we failed to intervene, Syria, the very opposite of the policy of intervention, where more people have died than in the whole of Iraq, with the worst refugee crisis since World War II, and with no agreement as to the future.
Isn't that launched, Richard, right at Barack Obama and his entire policy that we have seen with Syria of not going in and not making Syria another Iraq?
Yeah, well, it does certainly sound very much like that, doesn't it? I mean, Barack Obama, of course, in political sense, really represented a sort of pendulum away from the sort of Bush and Cheney doctrine of intervention. Right. Barack Obama, his kind of slogan was just don't do stupid stuff, don't get bogged down in further entanglements in the Middle East. And yet, I mean, there's not just a subtext in what we hear from Blair there about Syria. There's also a subtext about Obama's withdrawal of the troops from Iraq, which neoconservatives here and the Republicans certainly see as very hasty and having created that vacuum. So this debate about what's better, to intervene or not to intervene, you know, Libya, of course, is another example. Yeah. This debate is very, very live in this election year here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much alive. And, you know, in the year 2016, we're still talking about the decisions that were made in 2003, and we're still second-guessing ourselves. And no one, you don't find many leaders, except for maybe Barack Obama, who say there is no formula that we can follow for every situation.
Yeah, if you look what Mr. Blair said about his implicit criticism of Obama's foreign policy, I totally agree. In the diplomatic community in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, you have a lot of frustration with that ostentatious, you know, immobility. On the other hand, one has to conclude that Bashar al-Assad's regime benefited from the Iraq War, and it achieved its goal. Because after the Iraq War, the Syrian regime did everything to make sure it wouldn't be the next candidate. It wouldn't fall victim to, you know, American imperialist appetite, so to say, in the Middle East. So the funneling of jihadism, jihadist tourism that was sent from Syria across the border to Iraq, American and British intelligence services were very clear about that before, was part of this project. And in fact, ironically, one can say that the intervention in Iraq was also the reason why the United States did not intervene in Syria, because they had seen the results and they had seen the damage it had done. Yeah. So in the end, the Assad regime and Iran both benefited from this whole operation.
Daniel Gerlach, our Middle East analyst, and Richard Walker, our correspondent in Washington, both of you, thank you very much. We are almost finished with the day, but you can always join the conversation on Twitter, either